Change. Change, ironically, is one of the only constants in our lives. Think about yourself, your friends, your family. Think about how they were 10 years ago, even 20. Imagine yourself just 5 years ago and the changes that have already taken place. Even those of us who haven't really changed when it comes to the way we dress or the music we listen to, we still have changed. We have more knowledge, more experience, more pain, more joy, more everything. We change even if slowly over time, and that's to be expected. What's unexpected is when change or changes happen quickly, drastically, seemingly overnight. It's impossible to know when or even if this type of change, this sudden shift, is ever going to happen. Imagine waking up one day to find that the person you've slept next to for the last 10 years was just suddenly different. The look in their eyes, the way they speak, the way they stand, even the way they breathe. Hopefully this change is subtle, something manageable by both parties involved, because when it goes really wrong, the change is so sudden and drastic that all that is left is a wake of pain, suffering, and destruction. A broken road now littered with the hopes and dreams of all those affected. A wasteland once inhabited by normal people, changed forever by the actions of one who was once loved and trusted. Such is the tale this week. A story of a man who in the blink of an eye decided that something had to change. A man who, grabbing his favorite rifle, went on a warpath and for apparently no reason. This week we learn about a man who just snapped. A man named Dale Merle Nelson. As always, I'm Chase Ellerman, and this is Almost Fiction. Chapter 1. September 4th, 1970. Dale Merle Nelson woke up early Friday morning and walked out to his 1966 blue Chevy sedan and began to drive away from his small home in West Creston, British Columbia, Canada. He thought quietly to himself as he drove, replayed memories as he passed the homes of his wife's extended family. First and directly across the street was Iris Herrick's home, his mother-in-law. Then further down, his sister-in-law's house, Maureen McKay, who was in the middle of a divorce from her husband and now lived in the house with just her 4-year-old daughter for company. Continuing his drive out on the main road, he next passed Shirley Mae Wassick's house, who was his wife's aunt, but was almost the same age as him, maybe just a little bit older. She lived in a small home with her husband, Alex, and their 4 young daughters. He liked being an uncle. His nieces, one of the few bright spots in his life, usually brought a smile to his face, something that was becoming more and more rare these days. He then thought of his own 3 children and smiled again. That's why he was out that morning before the sun even crept over the horizon, trying to find work for the day. Something else that, like his smile, was becoming harder and harder to find. Dale drove the highway, making occasional stops at various logging outfits, places where he had previously worked, hoping that they might need an extra hand that day. Time after time, he has turned down one of a group of men who all walked away dejectedly, wondering if they were going to be able to find enough work before the next wave of bills came. Times were tough, and not just for Dale. There were many people out of work, many people who were just trying to put food on their tables. He finally made his last stop and struck out. Dale decided just to head home. He had driven the long way around, but On his way back, he decided to bypass the windy road of a highway and take the ferry instead. Pulling up to the boat, he saw its captain, Cecil Wilford, who waved at Dale as he bumped up the on-ramp to the boat. Still in low spirits from his fruitless job search, Dale just stared out of his windshield, remaining in his car for the duration of the crossing of the Kootenay River. The cloudy morning matched his spirits as Dale finally made it home at around 10 a.m. Sitting in his car in front of his small house, he tried to put that morning out of his mind. He had always been moody, silent, dark, all the way back to his childhood, which often caused tension in his life. If pressed, most people would describe Dale as cynical, maybe a little depressed, but for the most part, he had always handled it, at least until 8 months earlier when he had tried to take his own life. Dale had tried to shoot himself, but at the last second he moved his hand, still pulling the trigger and firing the gun into the air. That had gotten him a trip to Riverview Mental Hospital in Vancouver, where he was reviewed by psychiatrists before being cleared. And despite his dark periods, to his wife, he was an average husband, kind to his kids, and helpful despite sometimes being a little troubled. But lately, things were getting worse. Unknown to those around Dale, he had recently been dealing with a problem. Nobody really knew exactly what that problem was, but he was secretly ashamed about the fact that he was becoming increasingly sexually impotent, something he'd never talk about with his testosterone-filled logging co-workers. His new problem was only compounded by the fact that the only time he could get it up was after he had been drinking. The drinking and other issues were starting to get so bad that in April of 1970, Dale had appeared before Judge Harold Langston, a BC court justice, after he had been charged with assaulting his wife after his latest release from the Crease Clinic for the last time. The judge thought it a simple husband and wife matter, and that alcohol had probably been the main problem. Dale was convicted of the abuse and given 1 year of probation. Life was just getting complicated, but like always, he'd deal with it. And there was at least some good news on the horizon. Tomorrow, the hunt opened. Dale was an avid hunter and self-proclaimed best shot in the county, and he was happy to finally have this distraction. It was also a surefire way to put food on the table for his family. Climbing out of his car, he began to go through the mental checklist of everything he needed to get ready before the next morning, before he could finally have some recharging time alone in the woods. Chapter 2. The Lead-Up. 12 noon. Dale made his way back to the ferry a few hours after he crossed it the last time. He was in a much better mood and waved at Captain Wilford as he drove up the ramp. He was smiling and also in the company of his wife, her sister, and one of his own daughters. The small group disembarked from the ferry after crossing and make their way into downtown Creston for an afternoon of shopping as well as an optometrist appointment. Dale appeared to be in good spirits, smiling and actively engaging in conversations. He drove the crowded tourist-filled Canyon Street, a quaint throwback to happier days of the past. He then parked the car in a recently vacated spot and climbed out before spending the next few hours with his wife and daughter. Then, handing his wife the car keys, Dale told her that he needed to run a few errands and she could take off if she wanted. He could just find a ride back home later in the day. 3 p.m. Located just behind the post office off of 10th Avenue, the Creston liquor store was full of people buying supplies for the upcoming holiday weekend. Joseph Lawrence, the store's clerk, was busy helping the seemingly endless supply of customers. It felt like just about everyone in town was trying to stock up, and he did his best to accommodate as many as he could. Dale was known to the clerk, a regular who would just sometimes chat, but mostly came in, made his purchases, and left without any problems. According to Joseph, Dale seemed normal that day, picking up a 6-pack of beer and a 12-ounce bottle of cheap vodka. Just like always, Dale paid for his haul, nodded at Joseph, and left. 3:30 p.m. Stan Wickwire, a fellow logger, saw Dale on the other side of the Kootenai Cafe and waved. Dale waved back before finishing his cup of coffee and heading to the small bathroom at the back of the cafe. Only a minute later, almost like he had teleported straight there, Dale was entering the bar. It was already crowded that early afternoon, and he joined a logging buddy at a table underneath a sign that reads, "Bills over $5, please change at bar." The logging buddies all drank their beers while talking about the upcoming hunt. Dale also talked about how he needed to get back home before it got too late because he still had to get his rifle, a Mauser Model 98, which was on loan to his sister-in-law, who wanted it for protection due to the fact that she no longer had a man in her house. 4:30 p.m. Instead of leaving like he was planning, Dale had decided to drink a few more beers instead. Now up to 5, he finally began to feel that relaxed sensation that he was always searching for. He opened up, laughed, made jokes, and talked with anyone who looked his way. Now up to 8 beers on an empty stomach, Dale made his way over to another table and sat down, telling the unwitting occupants what a good shot he was and how he was going to bag a big one tomorrow. Don Korpowich, a logger from nearby Boswell, and Darcy Bolton, a gruff, overly hairy man, both already knew Dale and his reputation and nodded along with him as he regaled them of his hunts past, many of which he had already told them about. When he was finally done, Dale walked off, making his way to the bathroom, most likely laughing at the graffiti scrawled across the condom dispenser that read, quote, "The bubblegum in this machine tastes like rubber," end quote. After Dale was done relieving himself, he washed his hands and left the bathroom before finding another table and looking around the room for anyone who might be able to take him home. 5:30 p.m. Dale was in a really good mood. "Do you know where I can get some dope?" he asked Darcy Bolton, with Bolton answering, "No." Then Dale asked another question. "Can I get a ride home?" Bolton answered in the affirmative this time, nodding as he did so. Dale wasn't drunk, at least not really drunk, but 10 beers in, he was feeling good. Dale and his ride began to leave the bar, with Dale stopping for a brief moment to get a 6-pack before heading out with Bolton and one other man. The parking lot was full, but they found Bolton's car and began the drive to Dale's house, with Bolton opting to take the long way instead of the ferry. As they drove, Dale passed the beers around, and each of the 3 began to drink as the car continued down the highway. Bolton then slowed the car and pulled over when they got close to Dale's house and let the man out with only a short walk ahead of him. Dale was happy. "6 p.m. Shortly after arriving home, Dale tracks down his wife and takes his car keys back. He climbs behind the wheel and slowly, carefully, makes his way to his sister-in-law's house just up the road. He was definitely feeling it when he walked into Maureen's house, and she could tell. Only slightly embarrassed, Dale walked into the kitchen and said, quote, "Do you think you could do without my rifle for a few days? I want to go hunting in the morning," end quote. Heading to the closet, Maureen grabs the 7mm bolt action and hands it to Dale. Taking the gun, he checks it, unloads it, and places it on the floor beside where he sat in the kitchen. Dale was relaxed, content, and smiling as he chatted with his sister-in-law, as well as her aunt who had come over to visit. After a short while, Dale was still buzzed and feeling it, and had a little bit of a difficulty with the door latch as he left. He stumbled away into the fading light. "6:30 p.m. For the 3rd time that day, Dale took to the ferry, once again heading across the river towards the downtown area. This time he was much more talkative with Cecil Wilford, and even offered the captain a pull from a bottle of vodka that he was carrying. Wilford smiled, declined, and continued piloting the craft safely to the other side, dropping off his final customers before locking up the boat for the night. 7 p.m. Turning onto the main drag of Canyon Street for a second time that day, Dale saw that most of the tourists and locals had already begun to head home. Dodging the last of the crowds, he drove down the road before heading east past some fruit fields where a handful of leftover tourists still made purchases at the local side of the road stands. He then passed a honey farm, the Ponderosa and Empire hotels, and a few more homes before turning right into Brennan's garage. Earl Brennan, the owner, knew Dale, had even employed him for a time, and thought that Dale was dependable, if a little slow. Dale filled up his car at the pump before buying a box of 7mm ammo, explaining that it was for the upcoming hunt. He then left and continued down the road. 7:30 p.m. Dale hit object after object, never seeming to miss as he walked discarded items across the ground with the bullets fired from his gun. Now satisfied with how his firearm was operating, Dale climbed into his car and was once again on the road. 8 p.m. A few weeks prior, Dale had sold his beloved reloading equipment to a local sporting goods store due to lack of cash, and he was back to repurchase the items. Miss Eileen Swanson, who ran the store, told Dale that it was late and maybe she could help him better in the morning. Dale was adamant, however, and said that he needed it all back that night. Miss Swanson gave in and began to collect the reloading equipment while Dale helped her husband fix a broken lamp. It was an intricate job, but Dale's hands were solid as he did his work. Between that and the shooting, it appeared as if any intoxication had faded away. "8:30 p.m. For a second time that day, Dale enters the liquor store. This time, the evening clerk was working, and he helped Dale with his order, a small bottle of brandy as well as a bottle of wine. Dale seemed to be back to his quiet, reserved self. 9 p.m. Dale is once again in a bar, this time at the King George Hotel in Creston. He sat in a corner table, a quiet, almost motionless form, drinking and watching as people milled around him. A guitar lay next to him on the floor, an item borrowed from a friend before walking into the bar. The more Dale drank, the more outgoing he became, eventually moving around the crowded establishment, talking and laughing with his fellow patrons. 10:30 p.m. Grabbing the guitar and a few logging friends, mainly John McKay and Rex Smith, Dale also picked up a few beers, and the group headed to Smith's room, where Dale could play guitar while they all continued to drink. They sang a few songs and drank the beer as well as Dale's brandy, and Dale seemed to be in a good mood. 11:30 p.m. Just a half hour away from the open of the hunt, Dale told his buddies that he had to call it a night. Too late now for the ferry, he started out on the long way home, speeding across the flats towards West Creston. Dale's life was about to forever change. Chapter 3. The Incident. Shirley Wassick said goodnight to her niece, Maureen McKay, at about 6:20 p.m., shortly after Dale had left Maureen's house with his rifle. She walked home and made dinner for her daughters while Maureen put her own daughter to bed and sat down to watch TV. Later, she called her aunt and spoke with her for about 20 minutes before hanging up. Maureen then got a late-night call from one of her friends, Frank Shallor. Frank asked if he could come visit Maureen that night as he was in town for the long weekend on a break from vocational school in Kelowna, British Columbia. At approximately 10:30 p.m., the two sat in Maureen's home, just chatting while Maureen's daughter slept in the next room. 12:10 a.m. Neither Frank nor Maureen heard the car as it drove up to the house and stopped, but both heard the door of the car outside being slammed shut. Startled, both sat silent, quietly listening as the driver of the car approached the front door. They strained their ears as the disembodied footsteps climbed the squeaky wooden front stairs. Then the footsteps just stopped. A full minute later, the footsteps started up again, heading back across the porch away from the front door and back down the steps. Curious, Frank got up to investigate, and slipping out of the door, he stood on the porch, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the dark. When they finally did, he saw that the mysterious visitor had been Dale Nelson. Frank then watched as Dale's blue Chevy sedan turned onto the road and began to drive south. Maybe Dale had realized that Maureen wasn't home alone and left, or maybe he was just drunk. The two friends shrugged off the strange experience and went back to their conversation. About 5 minutes later, Maureen's phone rang. It was her Aunt Shirley, and she sounded scared. After a brief 30-second conversation, Maureen hung up the phone. Apparently, after leaving her house, Dale had gone to Shirley's house and he appeared to be drunk and was carrying his rifle. Frank Schaller decided to go over to investigate the situation. When Frank got to the house, he parked right next to Dale's '66 Chevy, turned his car off, and listened. He couldn't hear a single thing. Walking up to the front door, he knocked and waited. Finally, Shirley answered the door, and Frank asked if Alex, her husband, was home. She said he was not. He was on an overnight trip to one of the logging camps and that he'd taken their oldest with him. Frank tried to look around, noting that there was only one light on, and he strained his eyes trying to see past Shirley and into the house. He thought he saw a dark, tall outline, but he just couldn't be sure. From Shirley's face and the way she had answered him, Frank felt as if he was intruding and was being shooed away. Saying goodnight to Shirley, Frank headed back to Maureen's house. 12:15 a.m. Shortly after Frank left, Dale went to work. He had come here for a reason, and it was time to act. While her daughters slept in nearby rooms, Shirley was tied up by her niece's husband and brutally attacked as well as raped. When he was finished, Dale then turned his attention to one of Shirley's preteen daughters. Having woken up, one of Shirley's other daughters found her mom half naked and tied up. 12-year-old Debbie Wassick tried to help her mother, untying her hands and even placing a pillow under her head, but there was nothing that the young girl could really do. Her mother was breathing but unresponsive as Debbie tried to wake her, tried to help her blood-covered mother. Then a scream from her sister's room. Debbie had to do something, and the little girl just knew that her much older cousin Maureen would be able to help if she could just get to her house. Picking up a blood-covered fire extinguisher, Debbie threw it into the window before climbing out behind it. She ran away into the night. "12:20 a.m. Maureen kept replaying the phone call from her aunt over and over in her mind. Frank had already returned, already told her that nothing seemed to be wrong, but still, she had a feeling. Suddenly, both her and Frank are startled when they realize that someone was running up the gravel drive to the house. Moments later, small fists began to furiously beat at the door. Maureen jumped up and pulled the door open, only to have her young cousin Debbie nearly fall to the floor inside. Both adults tried to ask what was wrong, but only anguished screams came from the terrified young girl. Then finally, she was able to get something out. Cousin Dale had hurt her mother. She had heard his voice, heard her sister screaming, seen her mother hurt and on the floor. Maureen immediately called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. 12:25 a.m. Constable Earl Moker took the call that came into the duty room at the station in Creston. A Miss Maureen McKay said she was calling from West Creston, and she claimed that a woman had been attacked in the house next door. She said that the attacker was her brother-in-law and the victim was her aunt. She also stated that the attacker was possibly armed, having gone to her house earlier in the day to take back a rifle that he had loaned to her. Constable Moker immediately sent Constable Gary McClelland to West Creston before grabbing another officer and Constable Gus Slumba, and the two followed Constable McClelland in an unmarked car. With red light flashing, Constable McClelland tore down the road toward West Creston before he was flagged down by a man who was in the middle of the road. The man was Frank Schaller, and in his car parked on the side of the road, he had Maureen, her daughter, and young Debbie Wasick. Frank then told the officer he wanted to take Debbie to the hospital, but the officer told him to follow him to the home because he was unfamiliar with that specific area. Now catching up to the first car, the other two constables joined the growing caravan as they headed to the crime scene. "12:45 a.m. Upon arrival at the Wasick home, there was an eerie silence. Fearing that they were already in the crosshairs of a desperate man with a rifle, officers were trying to be cautious while also searching for anyone that could use their assistance. Dale's blue Chevy was still parked outside with a single porch light illuminating the front of the house as well as a portion of the driveway. Scanning the area for any signs of life, the officers finally noticed a small figure standing behind a fence. Charlene Wasick, naked from the waist down, stood motionless in the front yard. Leaving the cover of the car, one of the officers grabbed Charlene, lifting her over the fence before carrying her to her Aunt Maureen, who immediately took her to the Creston Valley Hospital. Slowly, Constables McClelland and Moker inched towards the house as Constable Slumba covered them from the yard. The front door was half open and a sharp shaft of light cut through the dark from the back of the house as officers entered. Inside of a back room, they found Mrs. Wasick still laying on the bed where her daughter had found her. She had extensive head injuries and appeared to have succumbed to her wounds. In the next room, they found young Tracy. She was also dead, lying in a pool of her own blood. She had a 9-inch cut that ran from her chest to her pubic area, and her internal organs were visible through the incision. There was also a cut that ran from ear to ear, passing through the child's mouth. The knife used had been discarded on the floor. After clearing the house, the officers went outside to radio in for backup. Before leaving, Maureen had asked officers to check up on her mother, who also lived close by, but before they could do that, officers knew they first had to check on the home of Dale Nelson. They drove towards Dale's house, eyes peeled for any sign of Dale along the way. Upon arriving, they find that Dale is not home, so they evacuate his family before moving across the street and evacuating his mother-in-law's home. Even though it had only taken 15 minutes to evacuate Dale's home as well as his mother-in-law's, when officers returned to the Wasick home, they arrived to find Dale's car was gone. They also noticed that a trail of blood that hadn't been there earlier now ran out of the house, across the steps, and down to where Dale's car had been parked. Once again, officers entered the house to find that Tracy Wasick's body had been taken. When they checked their own vehicle, the second car they had brought and left at the Wasick home, there was blood in the front seat as well as the steering wheel. Apparently, while they were down the road, Dale had re-entered the house, took Tracy's body, and then left in such a panic that he had attempted to drive away with the wrong vehicle before correcting his mistake and taking his own. Chapter 4. 12:50 a.m. Corporal Harvey Finch was awakened from sleep by the ringing of the telephone. As the second highest ranking officer at the station, and because his boss was away on summer leave, he was left in charge. He was informed that officers had called in for assistance and that they needed help after the discovery of 2 dead bodies. He made his way into the station and immediately called for an all hands on deck. As each officer arrived, they were issued a rifle and warned that the man they were looking for was dangerous and last seen carrying a hunting rifle. All officers were instructed that they were only to return fire if fired upon first. He then called other police stations in the surrounding area and apprised them of his situation. He told them that Dale Nelson was armed and extremely dangerous. 1 a.m. Elizabeth McKay, a sister-in-law to Maureen McKay, was puzzled when she heard a car driving down her rarely used road in the middle of the night. The car sounded like it was moving fast, and even though she didn't see the car, she could tell it was heading down the road in the direction of Ray Phipps' house. The Phipps family was poor. They lived in a one-room shack with 6 people sharing a room that measured only 18 feet by 24 feet. They made a living for themselves as farmers and barely made enough to support their family that consisted of Ray, his common-law wife Isabel St. Amand, and her 3 children from a previous marriage, 10-year-old Paul, 8-year-old Kathy, and 7-year-old Brian. The couple also had a child together, an 18-month-old Roy. 1:05 a.m. Inside the offices of the Creston RCMP, there was a buzz of activity. Officers were busy organizing the manhunt for the man accused of committing 2 murders just hours before. They pored over maps of the area, picking places where the man might be holed up. Then the phone rang. The caller was a terrified woman who desperately whispered into the phone. She said she was calling from the Phipps residence in West Creston and that there was a man at her home with a gun. 1:10 a.m. Gunshots ring out around the Phipps home. 1:30 a.m. Officers are racing to the Phipps house, hoping and praying they find the family barricaded in their home and safe. But when they finally arrived, they instantly realized that they were too late. Ray Phipps was found face down just inside the door to his home. He had been shot in the head and was missing the entire top half of his skull. Isabel was also discovered inside a gunshot wound to her own head. Officers then discovered the bodies of 3 children, each deceased, all shot in the head like their mother and stepfather. Officers counted 5 victims, but there were 6 beds in the room. Someone was missing. Talking to neighbors, they discovered that the missing person was 8-year-old Kathy. Isabel's only daughter was gone, and police were positive that she had been taken by Dale. Chapter 5. 6 a.m. West Creston residents awake to find they were in a lockdown. Before any vehicle could leave the area, it first had to be searched by armed RCMP officers. Other officers, a lot from surrounding areas, patrolled the streets, shotguns and rifles in hand, hoping to deter Dale from entering any of the more populated areas. Then the manhunt began, and 40 officers took to the surrounding area in a coordinated attempt to locate Dale Nelson. They searched hunting areas, abandoned houses, and known haunts of Dale's. They also searched the many dirt trails and paths in the area, careful not to present themselves as too good of targets. They also questioned Dale's family, who were all now in protective custody. The consensus seemed to be that Dale would not want to be taken alive, a theory that was backed up by his previous suicide attempt. Then, Mr. Wasik was found when he returned from his overnight logging trip. He had to be informed by those manning the roadblock what happened to his wife and children. 2 p.m. It had now been 13 hours since Dale killed the Phipps family, and neither him nor his car had been seen. While tire tracks and a broken fence had given some clue to the direction he was headed, officers still had no luck in finding him. They then decided to bring in a charter plane in order to search for Dale's car from the air. They had hoped that he had left the car somewhere and was still nearby. A pilot came in, but with no radio on his plane, he had no way of communicating with officers on the ground. He began a search pattern just north of the Phipps home and slowly began crisscrossing the area as he searched for any sign of Dale or his car. Officers on the ground watched as the search continued before noticing the plane begin to bank in a tight circle. Assuming he had found something, they began to move towards the area that the plane was circling. After following a few paths that could barely be considered access roads, officers finally stumbled across the car, seeing that it had been crashed into a ditch. The car was empty. At the very least, though, investigators had feared that they would find Tracy Wask's body, but there was nothing but bloodstains. While searching the car, they found empty boxes of bullets as well as a blood-encrusted hammer. Upon further inspection, it appeared as if there was also human hairs that had been stuck to the hammer by blood. They hoped that the hammer wasn't a sign of young Kathy's fate. 4:30 p.m. While crime scene specialists investigated the crashed car, other officers began to comb the area around where the car was found. Constable Laurier Lacoste, a young RCMP officer, was the first to make a discovery. He had found a child's arm. Converging on the discovery, investigators began to fan out, continuing their search. 20 feet away from the arm, they found a head, then a leg, then a torso, with the other arm and leg still attached. Investigators had finally found Tracy Wassick. They continued to search the area, but nothing else was discovered. Later, when the autopsy was performed, it was discovered that Tracy's heart had been removed and was still missing. Also missing were parts of her genital area. The question then became, what had Dale done with them? Sunday, September 6th, 1970, 10 a.m. The night had been uneventful. Though the search had continued, nothing substantial had been found. In a creek approximately 200 yards away from where Dale's car had been found, another discovery was finally made when an officer found the leg from a child's set of pajamas floating in a creek. Not far from where the pajama leg had been found, another discovery was made when officers found a tree with some rope loosely wrapped around it. It appeared as if someone had spent the night tied to a tree. 4 p.m. More than 36 hours now had passed and officers were still doing everything they could to find Dale. They periodically stopped by abandoned and empty houses, and on their latest visit to Nelson's own shack, an officer noticed that a polythene cover that had been placed over a window had been cut. They immediately called for backup and also called for Dale's wife, who came to the home in order to tell them if anything had been moved or taken. After officers had cleared the small home, Dale's wife Annette was escorted inside. She then searched her own home and told officers that yes, 2 items were for sure missing: a can of peas and a half-full bottle of aspirin. One of the crime scene investigators began examining the ground outside the window that had been broken into. Noticing footprints leading away from the house, he began to follow. Along the way, he also noticed bent plants as well as broken twigs, and at one point looked up to see Dale Nelson himself lying on the ground only 30 feet ahead of him. Dropping down immediately, he watched Dale, who seemed motionless with his hands resting on his chest. He appeared to be asleep, but his rifle was within reach, and the unarmed man was too afraid to get any closer. Carefully, the investigator crawled back towards the house. 5 p.m. When the officer in charge was informed that Dale had been found, he immediately reminded officers that he wanted him alive. He gave express orders that officers were not to shoot unless fired upon first. Quietly, officers surrounded the still sleeping Dale before one man yelled, quote, "Dale Merle Nelson, you are surrounded. Stand up and put your hands in the air." End quote. Dale didn't move. The order was repeated. No response. It was repeated once again. Nothing. Officers began to cautiously approach, and a K-9 officer was also brought up. Once more, they called out before releasing Count, the German Shepherd. Count ran forward before hitting Dale and pinning him to the ground. Right behind Count came his handler, who also jumped on Dale and was quickly able to handcuff him. Dale never resisted and was hauled to his feet while officers surrounded him. He seemed dazed, confused, unable to grasp the severity of his own situation. Dale was then read his rights. Quote, "Dale Nelson, you are under arrest and will be charged with the murder of Mrs. Shirley Wassick. It is my duty to warn you that you are not obliged to say anything. but anything you say may be given in evidence." End quote. Dale made no reply. Officers then searched him, removing everything from his person: a cartridge belt, 21 rounds of ammunition, a skinning knife, a wallet complete with photographs of his children, a set of car keys, cigarette papers, tobacco, nail clippers, a wristwatch, a dollar bill, and some change were removed from Dale's person. Dale was then led to the road where he was questioned about the whereabouts of Kathy St. Armand. "Dale, where is the Phipps girl?" Dale, now breathing heavy, replied, "I'll tell you. Give me a drink of water and a cigarette." Officers held a jug of water to Dale's mouth, letting him drink before placing a cigarette between his lips and lighting it. Dale took a heavy drag and leaned back against the seat, blowing the smoke out of his nose. "She's by the car." "Is she dead?" "Yes." The officer in charge left the car while others continued the interrogation. Dale then drew a map to where Kathy's body was discarded. 5:30 p.m. Kathy St. Amand was found face down on the ground where Dale said she would be. She was wearing only a t-shirt, and her back showed a puncture mark where she had been stabbed. Her hair was also encrusted with blood where Dale had struck her with the hammer. When she was turned over, officers were even more shocked and disgusted. Like Tracy, she had been disemboweled with multiple organs protruding from her stomach. 5:45 p.m. Dale was taken to the police station where he immediately confessed to the murders. He also confessed to taking LSD the night before, shortly before going on his rampage. After his confession, he was able to see his wife, but soon he slid into a state of depression and refused to talk with anyone at length. He spent most of his time pacing his cell and smoking, and at one time asked a guard a simple question with, quote, "Will they let me plead guilty?" End quote, to which he received no reply. He then said, quote, "You are all brave. I could have killed 10 of you had I wanted to." End quote. Once again, he received no reply. Chapter 6. Dale was arraigned before Judge Harold Langston on September 8, 1970, where he was charged with the non-capital murder of Shirley Mae Wassick. Standing before the judge, a local doctor, Dr. J.V. Murray, stated that he believed that Dale was mentally ill. Because of this, Judge Langston remanded Dale for 30 days so that he could undergo psychiatric examination at the Ocala Correctional Center in Vancouver. As inmate number 231399, he was confined to the observation unit in South Wing of the prison, and over a period of a month, he was routinely interviewed by prison as well as outside psychiatrists. During these interviews, Dale was heard saying things like, quote, "I had no reason to do it. I had no reason to do anything. It seemed like it wasn't even me. It seemed like I was standing there watching someone else, yet I knew it was me." End quote. Quote, "I hid in the bush and watched the police officers go in and out, and I seriously thought about shooting them." End quote. Quote, "I didn't want to shoot the guy, but for some reason it seemed necessary." End quote. Dale also talked about the many hallucinations he had had while sitting in his cell. Some of these hallucinations included mosquitoes that weren't there, a large dog, and 2 Japanese girls who liked to sit on his bed. But, in the end, after many different sessions, Dale was found to be mentally competent as well as mentally incompetent, depending on which doctor you talked to. Also during his stay in prison, Dale wrote an essay detailing his actions during the manhunt for him, an essay that, despite the many spelling errors, was detailed and coherent. Quote, "In the past, I have looked upon the RCMP as a spineless, backstabbing bunch of jesters. I have recently read in a well-known weekly magazine an article which I felt substantiated this. I have even taught my children to fear and ridicule the Mountie, putting before them every stumbling block at my disposal. I truly felt that these men were a disease to their forefathers and founders. I have heard tales of where in previous manhunts they have been afraid to venture into the woods to seek an armed man. However, I have recently had occasion to discover the true quality and courage of these men in scarlet coats. For I myself was a hunted man who eluded these men, sometimes sitting and watching their dauntless devotion to a duty in which they did not hesitate. For some years now, I have been an avid marksman who could hit a soup can at 50 paces every shot without sights on my rifle. So, these men knew what was in store for them when I was overtaken, which was inevitable as they had dogs tracking me, and I was armed with a high-power rifle with a 9-power scope sight. When I grew very wary of running and picked my spot to settle down to fight, it was in thick underbrush where visibility was no more than 20 feet. I was determined to die in this spot. When I heard the Mountie calling for my surrender with the aid of a bullhorn, I kept silent, for I thought they feared to venture further. Then I heard the man in charge instruct his men to advance, but to hold their fire and only fire if fired upon. As I lay with my rifle at hand, I could not bring it to bear, but could only stare with fascination as a corporal walked calmly through the brush toward me, the gun which he aimed at me not wavering nor his footsteps faltering. These men treated me with naught but courtesy and devotion while I was confined there and in transit to Ocala. So, I appeal to all citizens to take off your hats to these men, as they would be an honor to their forefathers." End quote. Because the two doctors were having a hard time coming together on whether or not Dale was mentally competent, a third doctor was brought in. After reading all the notes and after interviewing Dale himself, he decided that at the time of the murders, Dale was competent. February 1971. The Crown was ready to move forward with the preliminary hearing in the case of Dale Merle Nelson. Dale was officially going to be tried for the non-capital murders of Shirley Mae Wassick, Candace Tracy Jean Wassick, Raymond John Phipps, Isabel Alice St. Amand, Catherine Rose St. Amand, Paul Rogers St. Amand, Brian Ross St. Amand, and Roy Kenneth Phipps. But when prosecutors were going over the case that would soon be heading to trial, they decided that prosecuting Dale on all 8 charges could be cumbersome as well as confusing to the jury. So the decision was made to only prosecute Dale with 2 of the murders, 1 from each house. The trial date was officially set for March 22, 1971. Chapter 7. The day of the trial saw the courthouse relatively quiet. Despite the brutal nature of the crimes and the initial outrage when they occurred, there seemed to be little interest in Dale when his trial finally started. There were no hordes of people, no reporters or cameras. He looked like any other prisoner showing up for a random court case. Maybe the lack of attention was due to the fact that everybody already knew who had committed the violent and heinous crimes. They already knew that Dale was guilty. The question was he sane? Did he know what he was doing? And almost more importantly, did he know what the consequences were going to be? During the trial, a disturbing fact about the case was presented to the jury. After sexually assaulting Shirley Wassick and her daughter Charlene, Dale then made Charlene show him where the kitchen knives were before taking one and using it to murder her sister Tracy. Then, after cutting her stomach open, there was evidence to suggest that Dale tried to eat partially digested food that had still been in the girl's stomach. After 10 full days, both sides had presented their cases and the jury was sent to deliberate their decision. After only 3 hours, which included an hour-and-a-half break for dinner, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty. Dale was immediately read his sentence. Life in prison. He accepted the punishment with no complaint. He spent the next almost 30 years in prison before his death from throat cancer on February 10, 1999. He was 60 years old. The human mind can be a fragile thing. There is no doubt that Dale Merle Nelson was crazy. The question then becomes, was he crazy enough to not understand what he was doing? Was he crazy enough to not be held responsible for his actions? Luckily for everyone involved, especially for the family members of the surviving victims, the answer was no. This has been another episode of Almost Fiction, a podcast where we try to imagine what it was like in the moments where some of the worst crimes occurred. Thank you for all your support. If you love Almost Fiction but don't like the ads, for only $5 a month you can get Almost Fiction early and ad-free. You will also get access to Almost Fiction Plus, a bonus show for our supporters. Times are tough, and if money is too tight, it's just as important for us if you could rate the show and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments, you can send them to almostfictionpod@gmail.com. That's almostfictionpod@gmail.com. Almost Fiction also has a Facebook group, so head on over there to see the exclusive posters that accompany each episode, as well as to keep up with everything Almost Fiction related. Once again, thank you so much for all you do. And as always, I'm Chase Ellerman, and this is Almost Fiction.